Hey everybody, and welcome back to the channel. I'm Steven. This is Northwest Small Batch Brewing. And today the big question for the Brew Talk is, what is the next big thing that's going to happen in homebrewing? We always ask ourselves, what's the next big thing? Consider what was the last big thing. I would say it was fermenters. We started off with glass fermenters, and then they moved on to plastic, the PET fermenters, and they had their benefits. And then maybe right around that time, you also had people using plastic buckets that they, made from Home Depot buckets. That also worked really well. And then stainless steel came on. And you always have to be careful because the industry will tell you stuff to try to sell you their product and say it's better. There's a big movement that was saying, well, plastic's not good because it can get scratched and then hold microorganisms that you can't ever get sanitized. And yet, nobody ever had this problem. In fact, we all realized that that was probably just fake news trying to get us to buy the stainless steel fermenters. In fact, I've had plastic fermenters forever, and I'm sure that at this point they must have a scratch or two and never had a problem. So I think that's probably not that big a deal. But of course then stainless steel fermenters, and I have a couple of those from Anvil that I really like, but are they really necessary? I don't know. And then of course the next thing coming was pressurized fermentation, which I have a couple of those that I really like. And then of course now we're on to these stainless steel conical fermenters that are insanely expensive, and let's be honest, if you're just brewing like 5 gallons or less, it's super duper overkill. Alright, but that's not what this video is about. We want to know what's the next big thing in home brewing today. I believe it's something that's been around forever, probably before, human beings, but we never discovered it until recently. I mean, relatively recently, if you look at the big picture. And that is yeast. Now, how in the world can yeast be the next big thing if it's been around forever? I'll tell you. So, back when I first started homebrewing, you'd basically get a can of malt extract, and there would be a yeast packet taped on the top of it. That yeast packet was basically bread yeast. It was, it had way too much bacteria for home brewing in it. It was not made for home brewing. It was made for baking bread and stuff like that. So it worked, but it was not great. You didn't get great results from it. And in fact, early dry yeast, even when it progressed, was similarly just not as good because they didn't have the process down very well. So moving on down the line from that little dry packet of yeast, homebrewers started using liquid yeast because it was better for home brewing. They couldn't get dry yeast that was as good, so liquid yeast. The problems with liquid yeast mostly are that you maybe have to use a starter because there's not enough cells, that come with it. Now that's changed. You can get packets of liquid yeast that have all the cells you need in it now, but it didn't used to be that way. And then, of course, there's the temperature problem. You have to keep it refrigerated or it dies pretty quickly. So that's a problem. Or if it's too hot, right, it starts growing before you want it to within the package. And then eventually we started getting dry yeast that was pretty good, but not a very big variety of dry yeast. Just, here's your ale yeast, here's your lager yeast, and maybe some things sprinkled in, but there wasn't a really big, selection to choose from. So let's move forward to today and what's happening with yeast today. Let's start with the most current evolution, which is Kveik. Now, I already made a video on this. I'm not a fan of how Kveik is being used by homebrewers. It's not the yeast fault itself. It's what we're trying to make it do that it's not designed for. I should be able to link that video up here in the top corner for you if you'd like to see it. But basically, Kveik yeast is a farmhouse yeast. So if you're using it for farmhouse ales in the way it's intended, I'm sure it's great. But if you're using it to try to force a beer to ferment at higher temperatures rapidly, I have just had terrible results. It just doesn't turn out tasting good at all. It's pretty bad. So Kveik yeast is okay if you use it right, and that's another iteration in what's next in yeast. What came after that? Well, right now, White Labs, and I'm sure that other yeast companies are going to start getting on board with this, are making much more dry yeast. They've very recently started making a lot of the liquid yeast strains that they'd have. They're drying it, selling as dried yeast, because now they don't have to worry about refrigerating it to get it to vendors. And I'm going to go over some of the benefits and myths real quick here with dry yeast. But before I do, one more recent thing that's come out, two things really, but one is Nova Lager yeast, which is a lager yeast that you can use to ferment at a quote-unquote warm temperature. When we say warm, we mean warm for a lager. I'll get to that, I think, too, if I have time. And then there's also a new specialty yeast that I don't even know if it's out yet for home brewing, but it's basically used mostly for conditioning, bottle conditioning. It's better for bottle conditioning because it is non-diastatic. It doesn't have the chances of causing those gushers if you put too much sugar or whatever. Anyway, these are things that are coming down the line. So back to dry yeast. I'm a huge fan of dry yeast. In fact, I don't use liquid yeast at all. And now with White Labs coming out with all these new not new yeast, but they're drying all these yeasts that were not previously available to people who use dry yeast. So one of the problems people would say is, well, there's not much live yeast in a dry yeast packet, so it's not as good, or you don't know how much is in there. The reality is there's probably about 70% live yeast in a dry yeast packet. It's not really dead when they dry the yeast, right? It goes dormant, but they're not killing it. And the rest of the yeast packet, what's in there that's died, that's right, yeast are cannibals. They eat their own. So it actually becomes yeast food or yeast nutrient. So in fact, it's beneficial to the yeast to have some dead yeast in that packet. There's also this rumor that you can't wash your dry yeast. And that's not true. People have done it. People do it. You can wash your yeast after you used it. It's a process which basically allows you to make a starter and reuse that yeast several more times in future beers. So if you're making large batches of beer, then that's super beneficial. It's going to save you a lot of money. If you're making small batches, it's not as big a deal. The other thing is that oxygenation is really not needed for dry yeast. Look it up. I know it sounds crazy. I still do it. I still shake the bejesus out of my wort, but I consider it yeast as a sort of a fail-safe where, yeah, I'm going to shake it to oxygenate, but the reality is it shouldn't if I under-shake and don't quite get enough oxygen, it's sort of going to save my butt because it really doesn't need extra oxygen or oxygenation. That's already built in to the dried yeast packet. Also, down the line, there is some low or non-alcoholic dry yeast strains that are coming from Safel. That's pretty cool. So if you're looking at making that kind of beer, you're going to have that option with dry yeast. Yeah, and the Nova Lager, I think the range is like 50 to 68 degrees Fahrenheit. So you still have to keep it below room temperature, right at room temperature. So that's why I say warm, in quotes, for lager yeast. Yeah, I'll talk about that more because I'm going to make my next beer with Nova Lager yeast, and I'll explain that later. But that's pretty much it. That's all I had for you. I hope you found this insightful, and I'll see you again next time for the next Brew Talk. Make sure you subscribe and turn on your notifications if you want to know when my next video comes out. And until then, happy brewing.